He was born an Imperial and Royal Archduke of Austria, heir to a 1,000-year-old empire and the very pinnacle of society. He died a penniless, anonymous salami salesman in a Berlin tenement, so poor his widow had to sell his spoons to survive. He wasn't overthrown by war or revolution. He gave it all away for a kiss, his name, Leopold Ferdinand. How does a man born with everything willingly trade an empire to become a complete and total nobody? That shattering was inevitable. Leopold was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled. The ancient, rigid world of Habsburg duty he was born into, and the modern world of personal freedom he desperately craved. The Habsburg Empire in the late 19th century was not just a place, it was an idea. It was the last great bastion of absolute monarchy, a multi-ethnic, multilingual relic of the old world, desperately trying to ignore the ticking clock of modernity, and at its center sat one man, Emperor Franz Joseph I. This was not a king in the flamboyant sense. He was a bureaucrat, a Spartan, an almost painfully dutiful man who saw himself not as a ruler, but as the first servant of the state. He rose before dawn, worked 14-hour days at a simple desk, and lived a life of rigid, unforgiving protocol. His world was one of duty, tradition, and absolute unquestioning obedience. To the dynasty, Franz Joseph's personal life had been shattered by tragedy. His brother Maximilian, executed in Mexico. His son, Crown Prince Rudolph, a suicide at Meierling. These losses did not soften him. They calcified him. They reinforced his belief that personal desire, emotion, and individualism were poisons. The only antidote was the dynasty. The dynasty was everything. The individual was nothing, a mere link in a chain that stretched back 1,000 years and must stretch forward 1,000 more. And the primary mechanism for preserving this dynasty? Blood, specifically the purity of imperial blood. The Habsburgs had practiced intermarriage to a degree that is almost difficult to comprehend today. For centuries they had married their own cousins, their own nieces, all to consolidate power, protect their bloodline, and keep their vast holdings within the family. This policy had, of course, produced the infamous Habsburg jaw, a physical deformity that marked them as distinct. But the physical traits were the least of it. This centuries-long inbreeding had woven a dark thread of psychological instability, eccentricity, and emotional fragility throughout the family line. It was a dynasty haunted by mental illness, by strange compulsions, and by a volatile blend of brilliance and madness. This was the genetic lottery Leopold Ferdinand was born into. And Leopold's own world was even more specific, more pressurized. He wasn't just a Habsburg, he was a Tuscan Habsburg. His father, Ferdinand IV, was the Grand Duke of Tuscany, a title that sounds impressive until you learn one crucial fact. He had been exiled. His family had lost their throne in 1860 during the unification of Italy. So, Leopold was born into a family living in a strange limbo. They had all the wealth, all the titles, all the prestige of the Habsburg name, but no power. They lived in a magnificent palace in Salzburg, but they were royals in exile, ghosts clinging to a lost inheritance. This made Leopold's father even more conservative, even more rigid. He was a man clinging to the idea of absolutism, obsessed with outdated protocols, desperate to prove his branch of the family was still worthy, still pure, still relevant to the main court in Vienna. Leopold's own parents were a perfect example of the problem. Ferdinand IV and Alice of Bourbon-Parma were first cousins. They were both Habsburg descendants, continuing the tradition of weaving the genetic tapestry ever tighter. Leopold was, therefore, a product of this intense, claustrophobic, and genetically freighted environment. He was born into a world that demanded absolute conformity, yet his very genes were a chaotic mix of restless intelligence and volatile impulse. From his earliest childhood, it was clear he was different. Family accounts note his aversion to the endless, stifling protocols of his father's phantom court. He was impulsive, quick-tempered, and startlingly intelligent. He didn't just learn languages, he consumed them, eventually mastering 7. He had a restless, curious mind that could not be placated by the simple ceremonial duties of a spare archduke. This entire fragile, inbred world was under siege. Outside the palace walls, the 19th century was roaring to a close. Nationalism was tearing the multi-ethnic empire apart at the seams. Czechs, Hungarians, Serbs, and Croats no longer saw themselves as subjects of the emperor. They saw themselves as nations. The forces of liberalism, socialism, and industrialization were hammering at the ancient gates. The Habsburg world, with its rigid rules and obsession with blood purity, was a gilded cage, and the bars were beginning to rust. The necessity for change was screaming from every corner of the empire. But the Habsburgs' response, led by Franz Joseph, was not to adapt. It was to double down, to become more rigid, more strict, more obsessed with tradition. And into this pressurized, suffocating, decaying world, Leopold Ferdinand was born. He was a product of the system's greatest flaw, its inbreeding, and he possessed the one trait the system could not tolerate, an independent will. His life would become the symbolic battleground between the dying old world of dynastic duty and the nascent new world of personal freedom. He was in every sense a mold breaker, not because he wanted to be a reformer or a political figure, but because his very personality, that impulsive, passionate, eccentric nature so common in his family line, made it impossible for him to simply be the dutiful, silent prince he was born to be. He was a psychological time bomb, and the clock was ticking. This psychological time bomb, this blend of Habsburg volatility and razor-sharp intelligence, could not be contained by the phantom court. In Salzburg, Leopold was not a dullard, nor was he insane in a way that could be conveniently hidden away. He was perhaps too sane for the world he inhabited. He was a man of action and intellect, trapped in a life of pure ceremony. While his father, Ferdinand IV, obsessed over which uniform to wear for which minor holiday, Leopold was consuming books, mastering languages, and staring at maps of the world, a world he was forbidden from truly joining. His rise as a mold breaker, therefore, was not a quest for power, but a desperate search for an escape hatch. He found his first escape not in politics, but on the open water. Leopold was drawn to the sea. The Imperial and Royal Navy was, in the rigid hierarchy of the Habsburg military, a strange and slightly overlooked entity. The real prestige lay in the cavalry and the infantry, the traditional land-based armies that had forged the empire. The Navy, based far from Vienna and ports like Pola and Trieste, was more technical, more modern, and, by its very nature, more outward-looking. It was a place where mathematics, engineering, and navigation, real, tangible skills, mattered more than just one's ancient bloodline. For Leopold, it was perfect. It was a world of hard realities, a meritocracy of sorts, and most importantly, it was far away from the stifling, perfume-choked drawing rooms of the Hofburg and Salzburg. Predictably, the old guard, including Emperor Franz Joseph himself, was reluctant. The emperor was famously averse to anything that smacked of intellectualism or individualism. He liked his archdukes to be soldiers, obedient, dutiful, and not too bright. Leopold, with his 7 languages and his restless, questioning mind, made him nervous, But Leopold persisted, and he was finally granted permission to enter the Imperial and Royal Naval Academy. And here, in this new world of salt air and hard science, he didn't just fit in, he excelled. This was no ceremonial post. He was a dedicated, brilliant midshipman. He devoured charts, mastered celestial navigation, and learned the intricate engineering of the new steam-powered ironclads. In 1887, he didn't just graduate, he graduated first in his class. Think about what this means. The man the court dismissed as a flighty eccentric, a problem to be managed, proved himself to be the most capable and intelligent of all his peers when placed in an environment that valued actual skill. His naval career was a triumph. He was promoted to ship-of-the-line lieutenant, and his eccentricity, which at court manifested as impatience and defiance, on a ship manifested as restless energy, a quick mind, and a natural command. For a few brief golden years, Leopold had found a life that worked. He had found a place where his Habsburg brilliance was an asset, and his Habsburg volatility was tempered by the rigid, practical discipline of the sea. But the court was never far away. An archduke, even a naval one, could not simply be a professional. He was, first and foremost, a pawn in the dynastic game. And it was here, in this period of his life, that his rebellious nature began to truly clash with the system, not just in career, but in love. Between 1885 and 1889, Leopold began a serious, passionate, and very secret romance with Infanta Elvira of Spain. This was not a flirtation. It was a multi-year commitment, and on the surface it might have seemed plausible. She was a Bourbon, royalty of the highest order. But the union was, for reasons both political and personal, forbidden by Emperor Franz Joseph. Perhaps the emperor feared the union of two such volatile, passionate bloodlines. Perhaps he had other plans for Leopold, or most likely he simply distrusted Leopold himself. He saw the young man's passion, his refusal to be a simple, obedient piece on the chessboard, and he acted to quash it. The relationship was forcibly broken. For Leopold, this was a devastating blow. It was the first critical moment where the system personally and irrevocably failed him. His success in the Navy proved he could be dutiful and brilliant. But the emperor's veto on his marriage proved that his personal happiness would always be secondary to the abstract, cold demands of the dynasty. It reinforced the lesson that love was not for him, not real love. He was expected to marry some bland, pre-approved German princess, produce heirs, and keep his passions for the shadows, for discreet affairs with opera singers or actresses, as was the custom for men of his class. This hypocrisy, this demand that he live a public lie, was something his intelligent, impulsive, and increasingly cynical mind could not accept. The seeds of his great rebellion were sown here, in this first bitter romantic failure. His superiors perhaps sensing his growing frustration, and the emperor likely wanting this problem archduke as far from Vienna as possible, approved an extended tour. Between 1892 and 1893, Leopold embarked on a massive world journey, visiting India, Australia, and the Far East. This was a massive deviation from the norm. Habsburg archdukes simply didn't do this. They didn't travel like explorers or adventurers. But Leopold went, and he was accompanied by an equally problematic, difficult, and stubborn relative, his cousin, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This relationship is one of the great tragic what-ifs of history. On paper, Leopold and Franz Ferdinand should have been allies. Both were intelligent, intense, and deeply frustrated by the stifling, archaic court of Franz Joseph. Both were, in their own ways, mold breakers, and both would famously defy the emperor by choosing to marry for love, selecting unsuitable women from outside the royal circle. They should have been brothers in arms, a new generation pushing for reform. Instead, they despised each other. Their rivalry was not just personal, it was toxic, petty, and legendary within the court. The world tour was not a bonding experience, it was a disaster. Franz Ferdinand, though only a few years older, was higher in the line of succession. He was famously arrogant, prickly, and obsessed with protocol when it suited him. He treated his cousin Leopold not as an equal, but as a subordinate, almost a servant. There are accounts from this trip of Franz Ferdinand, the future emperor, attempting to humiliate Leopold, making him handle the luggage, ordering him about like a common adjutant, and publicly mocking his eccentricities. For Leopold, a man who had just graduated top of his naval class and who was, frankly, probably smarter and more worldly than his cousin, this was an unbearable, unforgivable insult. This rivalry was a tragedy of two men, both damaged by the system, turning their rage and frustration not against the system itself, but against each other. Franz Ferdinand, who would later fight his own brutal battle to marry his beloved non-royal Sophie Chotek, was here ironically, enforcing the very same cruel, arbitrary hierarchy that was also crushing him. This trip, which should have been Leopold's greatest escape, instead became another cage, this time shared with his greatest rival. He returned to Austria more isolated than ever. He had no allies. The Navy, his first love, now felt like just another part of the system. His family saw him as a problem. His cousin, the heir to the throne, was his bitter enemy. He was trapped, and he was simmering. And so, Leopold, the brilliant naval officer, the master of 7 languages, the man who had seen the world, began to drift. He was an archduke with no real duties, a man of immense energy with no outlet. He fell into the life expected of him, but he did it with a self-destructive, defiant recklessness. The system wanted him to have discreet affairs? Fine. But he wouldn't be discreet. He wouldn't play by their hypocritical rules. His first major public scandal was not with Wilhelmine. It was with another common woman. We don't know her name, only that she was from a middle-class background and that she gave birth to his illegitimate daughter, Leopoldina now. This is a crucial moment. An illegitimate child was a serious scandal, but it was a manageable one. The Habsburg system had protocols. For this, Leopold's father, the rigid Ferdinand IV, stepped in. The mother and child were provided for. They were given a handsome sum, a comfortable life on one condition: secrecy. They were to exist in the shadows, a non-fact, a problem that had been solved with money. The system worked. The sin was committed. The bloodline was protected from taint. And the public facade of Habsburg piety was maintained. Leopold was supposed to learn his lesson from this. This is how you handle your personal life. You sin, you pay, you hide, and you move on. But Leopold learned the exact opposite lesson. He was disgusted by it. He was disgusted by the cold financial transaction, the reduction of a woman and his own child to a line item in the family budget. This, he felt, was the true perversion. And then, around 1902, it happened. The final fatal turning point. He was walking in the Augarten, a park in Vienna, when he met a young woman. Her name was Wilhelmina Adamovich. The official court histories, the gossip columns, the angry letters between family members, all describe her with one loaded word: prostitute. And perhaps she was. Perhaps she was a woman of the streets, forced into that life by poverty. Or perhaps, and this is just as likely, that was simply the only label the court could give her. A convenient, vicious slander to discredit her, to explain away the Archduke's madness. In the eyes of the Habsburgs, any common woman who would entangle an Archduke who wasn't of the high nobility was, by definition, a prostitute. Her actual profession was irrelevant. She was in every conceivable way the most unsuitable woman on the planet. But Leopold saw something else. We will never know the true nature of their first conversation, but in Wilhelmina, this ordinary, unsuitable woman, Leopold found the one thing the glittering royal world had never offered him: authenticity. She was real. She was not a duchess playing a political game. She was not a princess bred for dynastic duty. She was a woman, and in her, he saw a chance for a real, unfiltered human connection. He fell not just in lust, but in love. And this time he would not be bought off. He would not be placated. He would not hide. This, for the court, was a 5-alarm fire. This was not a manageable scandal like his illegitimate daughter. Leopold wasn't just having an affair with her. He announced his intention to marry her. This was the revolutionary act. He wasn't just breaking the rules. He was shattering the very foundation of the dynasty. To marry a commoner, a prostitute, was to publicly declare that his personal happiness mattered more than the purity of the Habsburg bloodline. It was to import the middle-class, romantic notion of marriage for love into the one family on earth for whom that concept was treason. It was a direct, public, and utterly unforgivable assault on his father, his family, and his emperor. The system went into overdrive. His father, Ferdinand IV, was apoplectic. The family convened. This could not stand. They reverted to their one proven tool, money. They made Leopold an offer. It was the same deal as before, but on a grander scale. They offered him a staggering 100,000 florins to end the relationship. It was a fortune, enough to set Wilhelmina up for life, to make her disappear, to turn this public crisis back into a private, manageable secret. Take the money, they essentially said. Keep her as your mistress. We will look the other way, but you cannot marry her. And Leopold, the man who had been humiliated by his cousin, denied his first love by his emperor, and forced to hide his own child, made his choice. He refused. He refused the money. He refused the compromise. He refused to live the lie. He chose the woman. He chose the prostitute. He chose, in essence, to commit dynastic suicide. The standoff was over. Leopold had called their bluff, and in doing so, he had placed a bomb in the very center of the Habsburg Empire. The only question now was how to defuse it. Seeing no other path, Leopold took the final, unthinkable step. On December 29, 1902, he wrote a formal petition directly to the top, Emperor Franz Joseph. The letter was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. He, Leopold Ferdinand, Archduke of Austria, Prince of Tuscany, etc., formally requested permission to renounce all of his titles, all of his rights of succession, all of his privileges, and his very membership in the Imperial House of Habsburg-Lorraine. He was not just asking to marry a commoner, he was asking to become one for Franz Joseph. This was the ultimate failure, the ultimate scandal. It was worse than his son Rudolph's suicide at Merling. That was a tragedy of madness. This was a choice, a rational, calculated rejection of everything the emperor stood for. But Franz Joseph was, above all, a pragmatist. He had two options: an archduke living in open, scandalous sin with a prostitute, thumbing his nose at the emperor, a walking, talking symbol of imperial impotence, or a nobody, a private citizen living quietly in Switzerland. The choice was clear. The scandal had to be contained. The only way to defuse the bomb was to remove it from the palace entirely. He approved the petition. In 1903, the act was finalized. It was a surgical, bureaucratic excision. Archduke Leopold Ferdinand ceased to exist in his place. A new man was created, Herr Leopold Wölfling. He adopted the name from a mountain pseudonym he'd used to travel incognito, a final romantic flourish. He was stripped of his titles, his honors, his military rank. He became a citizen of Switzerland, a neutral, non-royal nation. And the family? They finalized the transaction. He was given an initial settlement of 200,000 florins and a guaranteed annual allowance of 30,000 florins. It was not a punishment. It was a buyout. It was the price the Habsburgs were willing to pay to make him disappear. And just like that, he was free. On January 27, 1903, in the small Swiss town of Verrier, Leopold Wölfling married Wilhelmina Adamovich. He had done it. He had won. He had traded the suffocating weight of an empire for the simple freedom to love whom he pleased. He had proven his autonomy. He had escaped the gilded cage, and he even had the money to live comfortably. The world, it seemed, was his. He immediately enrolled in university, studying his passions, natural sciences, botany. He was no longer a restless prince. He was an intellectual, a student, a husband. He was, for the first time in his 34 years, the master of his own life. This was his peak, his game-changing victory. But as Leopold Wölfling, the new student of botany, opened his books, he was unaware of a fundamental, fatal truth, that the very flaws, the impulsiveness, the romantic idealism that had just won him his freedom, were the exact same flaws that would, inevitably, lead to his utter and complete ruin. And so, Leopold Wölfling began his new life. On the surface, it was everything he had ever claimed to want. He was free from the suffocating two-dimensional world of court protocol. He was no longer a symbol, a mere archduke, a piece of imperial property. He was a man. He was a husband. And to his great delight, he was a student. He enrolled at the University of Zurich and later studied in Munich and Berlin. He, a man whose mind had been praised even by his enemies, was finally free to use it. He dove into his passion, natural sciences, specifically botany. It's a fitting choice, isn't it? Botany is a world of order, of classification, of logical, observable rules. It was the complete rational antithesis to the arbitrary, chaotic, and unwritten laws of the Habsburg court. He had, in essence, won the central paradox of his life. He had proven that he could be both intelligent and free. He had his great love by his side and a comfortable, secure life, funded by his family's generous buyout. The 200,000 florin lump sum was a vast fortune, and the 30,000 florin annual allowance guaranteed him a life of upper-class comfort forever. He had, in one brilliant, defiant stroke, solved all of his problems. He had escaped, but here, in this victory, lies the very heart of Leopold's tragedy. He had succeeded in renouncing his title. He had succeeded in renouncing his name, but he had failed to renounce the one thing he couldn't, his nature. He had, in his haste, failed to read the fine print on his new freedom. And it was this fatal flaw, this unexamined, impulsive, and deeply ingrained Habsburg part of his soul, that would unravel his new life with the same speed and certainty with which he had created it. Let us begin with the marriage, the very catalyst for his entire rebellion. He had sacrificed an empire for Wilhelmina Adamovich. He had traded palaces for a normal life with a normal woman. But what Leopold, in his romantic idealism, had failed to consider was the crushing, day-to-day reality of that choice. He had not, in fact, married a normal woman. He had married a concept. Wilhelmina, the prostitute, was his symbol of defiance. She was the weapon he used to wound his family. She was the living, breathing proof of his rejection of their entire world. But after the wedding, after the press had moved on, after the ink was dry on his renunciation, he was no longer an archduke committing a revolutionary act. He was just a husband. and she was just a wife, and the fantasy he had built around her began to crumble. Consider her perspective. She was plucked from the streets of Vienna, a world of desperation and survival, and thrust into the center of the biggest royal scandal of the decade. She was now Frau Wölfling, the wife of the world's most famous ex-prince. Every newspaper in Europe knew her name, and she was living in Zurich, a city of wealthy, conservative, and deeply snobbish Swiss society. How do you think they treated her? They saw her exactly as the Habsburg court did, as a grasping, low-born adventuress, a prostitute who had trapped a prince. She was shunned. She was whispered about in every shop, at every cafe. She was utterly, profoundly alone. She had been saved by Leopold, but in doing so, she had been isolated from everyone she had ever known and barred from the new world she was supposed to inhabit. And what of Leopold? He was a man who spoke 7 languages, who had debated with his era's sharpest minds, who had traveled the world, who had commanded naval vessels, and who was now deep in the intellectual world of natural science. What did he and Wilhelmina talk about? The power dynamic was impossibly skewed. He was her savior, her benefactor, her entire world. She was his wife. The romantic ideal of the authentic, simple woman is a beautiful thing in a poem, but it can be a crushing bore in a marriage. The very normalcy he craved in her was perhaps the thing that ultimately drove him away. He wasn't normal. He was a Habsburg. He was intense, volatile, arrogant, and brilliant. He needed conflict. He needed intellectual stimulation. He needed drama. His quiet life as a student with his quiet, normal wife was, in a way, just as boring as his old life of court ceremony, and then there was the money. Leopold had been given a fortune, but he had the financial literacy of a child. Archdukes do not handle money, they do not budget, they do not invest. Money to a Habsburg was an abstract concept, a river that simply flowed endlessly from the state and the family estates. Leopold, as Herr Wölfling, continued to live like an archduke. He had a fine apartment, he wore the best clothes, he ate at the best restaurants, he bought whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. He was, after all, a man of impulse. His lump sum of 200,000 florins, which should have been his nest egg, his capital, he treated as income. He was burning through it. He was a man who had never been told no in his life, and he wasn't about to start telling it to himself. His eccentricities, his impulsiveness, were not just personal quirks. They were financially catastrophic. The marriage, the grand romantic gesture that had cost him everything, lasted barely 4 years. In 1907, they were divorced. The whole premise of his new life, the foundation upon which he had built his freedom, had proven to be a fantasy. He had not just failed at being a prince. He had now, in the eyes of the whole world, failed at his first great self-chosen task, being a husband. This, for his psychology, was devastating. It proved his critics right. It proved he was just an impulsive, unstable, eccentric Habsburg who couldn't manage his own life. It proved perhaps to himself that the problem wasn't the cage. The problem was him. And how did Leopold, this man of deep thought and intellectual passion, respond to this profound personal crisis, this moment of failure that should have prompted deep self-reflection? He did the most Leopold thing imaginable. He proved his impulsiveness was not a situational flaw, but a systemic one. He didn't just get divorced, he got remarried, almost immediately. He didn't just remarry, he married another unsuitable commoner, a woman named Maria Magdalena Ritter. He didn't learn a single lesson. He didn't pause, he didn't reflect. He simply repeated the exact same pattern, the same impulsive grasp for a romantic ideal, proving to the world and to his horrified family that he was utterly, hopelessly himself. He was a man defined not by his intelligence, but by his appetites for love, for freedom, for drama, and he had no control over any of them. And here, the central paradox of Leopold's life becomes agonizingly clear. We must look at his foil, his great rival, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. For at the exact same time Leopold was imploding his life, Franz Ferdinand was also fighting the system for love. He too had fallen for a commoner, the Czech Countess Sophie Chotek. He too faced the wrath of Emperor Franz Joseph. But look at the difference. Franz Ferdinand, the pragmatist, the political animal, did not run away. He did not renounce his title. He fought. He negotiated. He bent the iron bars of the system until they almost broke, but he never fled the cage. He forced the emperor to accept a morganatic marriage. He agreed that his children would never inherit the throne, but he kept his titles. He kept his palaces. He kept his military rank. He kept his position as heir. He outmaneuvered the old emperor, winning his love and keeping his power. Leopold's grand victory, his flight to Switzerland, now looked in comparison childish. It looked like a tantrum. Franz Ferdinand had been a revolutionary, fighting from within and forcing the ancient dynasty to change, to create a new modern category of marriage. Leopold had just quit. He had taken his toys and his money and gone home, only to find he didn't know how to play with them. This contrast, this public humiliating success of his greatest rival, must have eaten Leopold alive. He was no longer the brave romantic hero. He was the family fool. But the true fatal flaw in Leopold's new life, the real ticking time bomb, was not his marriage, his impulsiveness, or his financial stupidity. It was something he had never, ever considered. It was the very source of his independence, his money, his 30,000 florin annual allowance, the river of gold that allowed him to live his life of a gentleman scholar. Where did it come from? It came from the Habsburg family fund. It was a direct payment from the very empire, the very family he had so publicly rejected. His entire freedom was a complete and total illusion. He was not a free man. He was a remittance man. He was a black sheep, exiled to a comfortable pasture in Switzerland, paid handsomely by his family to stay away and not cause any more embarrassment. He hadn't escaped the system at all. He was, in the end, just another one of his father's manageable scandals, just like his illegitimate daughter. He was on a leash, a very long, very comfortable golden leash. And here is the ultimate catastrophic irony. What happens to a man whose entire life is funded by an empire? When that empire ceases to exist, what happens to your allowance when the family that pays it is overthrown, expropriated, and exiled themselves? Leopold Wilfling, the brilliant botanist, the defiant romantic, the man who had traded an empire for freedom, had built his entire world on the slopes of an active volcano. He was blissfully, ignorantly, living a life of leisure, funded by a system that was about to be blown to pieces, and the spark that would light the fuse, the spark that would incinerate his world, his income, and his last shred of security, would be the assassination of the one man he despised most in the world, his cousin and his foil, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The bomb was ticking, and Leopold couldn't even hear it. The shot that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo was the shot that lit the world on fire. It was the spark that ignited the First World War, a cataclysm that would slaughter millions and redraw the map of Europe. For most of the world, it was a political crisis of unimaginable proportions. But for Leopold Wilfling, living his comfortable academic life in Switzerland, it was something far more personal and far more immediate. It was the sound of a guillotine blade sliding into place directly above his golden leash. The death of his greatest rival, the man he despised, was not a victory. It was, in the most profound and ironic way possible, the beginning of his own execution. His entire independence, his life as a free man, was funded by one source, the Habsburg family fund. It was, in effect, a payout from the emperor. But in 1914, the emperor's priorities changed overnight. The Habsburg family fund was no longer a resource for managing embarrassing relatives. It was a war chest. Every florin, every crown was needed for the war effort, for bullets, for cannons, for soldiers' boots. The annual 30,000 florin allowance to an impulsive, self-exiled traitor living in neutral Switzerland, that was the very first expense to be cut. The tap was turned off instantly and permanently. Leopold's overconfidence, his hubris, was suddenly laid bare. He had believed in his independence. He believed he had escaped. He had failed to realize he was just a well-paid pensioner of a system he claimed to hate, and now the system was at war. His second marriage to Maria Magdalena Ritter, already as impulsive as the first, was now under a new, unmanageable pressure: poverty. The man who had lived like an archduke, spending his capital as if it were income, now had no income at all. The river of gold had dried up. This was the great structural betrayal. The world had pulled the rug out from under his entire illusory life. And what does this man of high intellect and grand romantic gestures do? He tries to rejoin the only other world he ever truly knew, the military. But he can't go back to the Austro-Hungarian Navy. He has renounced his rank, his commission, his very citizenship. So in 1915, in a move of profound desperation and tragic irony, he travels to Germany and offers his services to the German army. He, a Habsburg, attempted to serve as a common soldier in the army of Austria's ally. And what happens? He is rejected. Why? Because he is no longer an Austrian archduke. He is, on paper, Leopold Wölfling, citizen of Switzerland. And Switzerland is neutral. The very freedom he had purchased, the passport that proved he was his own man, was now the final bureaucratic stamp on his uselessness. He was not a prince. He was not a soldier. He was not an Austrian. He was not a Swiss. He was quite literally nothing, a man without a country, without a purpose, and now without a cent. For the next 3 years, Leopold and his wife simply survived. We don't know how. They likely lived off the last dregs of his squandered capital, selling possessions, borrowing, sinking deeper and deeper into debt and obscurity, and then, in 1918, the final apocalyptic blow. The Central Powers lost the war. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that ancient 1,000-year dynasty, did not just lose, it disintegrated. It shattered into a dozen new countries. The new Republic of Austria, rising from the ashes, was in no mood to be kind to its former masters. In 1919, the Habsburg law was passed. The dynasty was formally banished, exiled from Austrian lands. And, most critically for Leopold, all Habsburg family property, the funds, the estates, the palaces, was expropriated. It was seized by the state. This was the end of the illusion. His allowance wasn't just paused by the war. The source of the allowance was now gone. It had ceased to exist. The Habsburg family fund was no more. There was no going back. There was no renegotiation. There was no one to appeal to his father. Ferdinand IV had died in 1908. His old rival Franz Ferdinand was dead. The emperor Franz Joseph had died in 1916. The entire world he had defied was gone, and it had taken his lifeline with it. His great victory of 1903, his freedom, was now revealed to be the single most foolish, short-sighted, and self-destructive gamble of his life, it was a Pyrrhic victory of the highest order. He had won his freedom, only to lose his entire world, a world he now ironically, desperately needed to survive. His family ties, the last possible safety net, were useless. His brother Archduke Joseph Ferdinand was also now a private citizen, struggling to adapt. The entire Habsburg network had been shattered. His alliances in the academic world, his intellectual friends, they were useless. They were professors and scientists, not bankers. They couldn't support a penniless ex-prince. And so began the great humiliating unraveling. Leopold Wölfling, the man who spoke 7 languages, the man who had graduated first in his naval class, the man who had studied botany at great universities, was forced to find work. And the post-war economy had no place for a man with his unique, useless resume. He first found a job as a simple foreign language clerk. He who had once discussed statecraft and philosophy in French, Italian, and English was now using his linguistic skills to translate shipping manifests and business letters for a pittance. But even that, it seems, did not last. His pride, his arrogance, his eccentric Habsburg nature likely made him a very difficult employee. He was a prince, and he could not or would not learn to be a worker. And so he attempted to become his own boss. He pooled what little money he had left, perhaps from selling his wife's jewelry, and opened a small delicatessen in Vienna. This is the moment the tragedy curdles into a bleak, absurd comedy. Archduke Leopold Ferdinand of Austria, Prince of Tuscany, great-grandson of Holy Roman Emperors, was now a shopkeeper. He was selling salami and olive oil to the very same Viennese burghers his ancestors had ruled for 600 years. It was a pathetic spectacle. People didn't come to buy his wares. They came to stare. They came to gawk at the fallen prince, to whisper, to point, to see how low the mighty Habsburgs had sunk. The shop, naturally, was a catastrophic failure. He was bankrupt again. His financial ruin now total, he hit the absolute unimaginable rock bottom. He took a job as a tourist guide at the Hofburg Palace, his ancestral home, the very palace where he had been presented at court, where he had chafed against the rigid protocols, was now the place he had to walk through day after day for a few shillings, explaining his own family's history to gawking, curious strangers. Imagine the psychological torture walking through the throne room, the state apartments, pointing to a portrait of Maria Theresa and saying, "She was my great-great-great-grandmother," and then holding out his hand for a tip. This was not a betrayal by one person. It was a betrayal by fate itself. It was a humiliation so perfect, so complete, it's almost poetic. He couldn't bear it. The whispers, the pity, the unwanted recognition from old courtiers. He fled. He quit the job, a broken man. He had to escape Vienna. The city was a museum of his own humiliation. He fled to Berlin, the great anonymous modern metropolis. Here he hoped he could disappear, or perhaps reinvent himself one last time. In Berlin he found a new strange sort of work. He began to monetize his tragedy. He did cabaret performances telling wry, self-deprecating stories about the fall of the empire. He was hired to do film commentary, most notably for a 1928 film tour of the fate of the House of Habsburg. He was literally selling his own family's downfall as after-dinner entertainment. And here, in this final strange chapter, a different side of Leopold emerged. The intellectual, the progressive. He began to write. He wrote articles for the Berliner Morgenpost, and in 1932, as the dark tide of Nazism was rising all around him, this ex-prince, this descendant of the purest, most inbred bloodline in Europe, wrote a passionate article denouncing the very concept of racial purity. There is no racial purity, he declared. He argued with all his intellectual might against the hateful pseudo-scientific theories of the Nazis. It was brave. It was clear-sighted. It was perhaps the noblest act of his entire chaotic life. He had finally found a voice, a purpose, a modern way to use his name and his intellect. But his entire life was a story of tragic irony. And this final brave stand would be no different. The intellectual allies he had finally found, the liberal intellectual world of Weimar Berlin, was about to be obliterated by the very forces he was writing against. His betrayal was not over. The darkest chapter was just about to begin. In 1932, Leopold Wölfling had, for a brief shining moment, found a new voice. He was no longer a cabaret act, no longer a delicatessen owner. He was a public intellectual, a writer. And his target was the darkest, most ascendant force in his new country, the Nazi Party. He, the man born from the most obsessively pure, inbred bloodline in European history, the man whose own family was a walking, talking psychological testament to the disasters of blood purity, took to the pages of a major Berlin newspaper to denounce the entire concept. His anti-racism articles were brave. They were intelligent. They were, in the context of the time, extraordinarily defiant. He had at last found a way to synthesize his unique, bizarre life, his Habsburg past and his commoner present, into a powerful modern message. He had finally found his allies in the liberal intellectual circles of Weimar Berlin. His long, chaotic journey from prince to pauper had finally, it seemed, led him to a place of meaning. And then just 6 months later, the final, most catastrophic betrayal of his life began. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The intellectual, liberal, democratic world of the Weimar Republic, the world that had given Leopold his new voice, evaporated overnight. It wasn't just a political change, it was an extinction event. The Berliner Morgenpost, his publisher, was swiftly brought into line, its Jewish editors and liberal writers purged. The allies he had just found were now themselves running for their lives, becoming exiles and refugees, just as he had been. His brave articles, they were now evidence. They were, in the new language of the Third Reich, the degenerate scribblings of a reactionary, a monarchist, a race defiler. The very act that had given him his final shred of dignity now painted a target on his back. The problems he had fled his entire life, repression, conformity, a rigid, intolerant system that demanded total obedience, had returned, but in a form so monstrous, so complete, that it made the court of Emperor Franz Joseph look like a paradise of liberal freedom. He had fled a gilded cage only to find himself trapped, penniless and old, in an iron one. His last meager source of income, his writing, was gone. He was now once again nothing, but this time he was not just a nobody, he was an undesirable. He was a man with a famously aristocratic name, a known anti-racist writer, and a Habsburg, to boot a dynasty the Nazis both faintly admired and deeply distrusted, seeing them as internationalist, Catholic, and insufficiently German. He was trapped in the belly of the beast with no money, no passport to freedom, and no allies. And what did Leopold, this man of profound, unshakable, romantic impulsiveness, do in the face of this absolute final darkness? What was his last act of defiance? In 1933, at the age of 65, in the midst of his total financial ruin, as the Third Reich consolidated its power, Leopold Wölfling got married for the third and final time. He, who had been divorced by his first great love, Wilhelmina, and who had also divorced his second wife, Maria Magdalena, now married Clara Hedwig Pawlowski. It is an act so Leopold, so perversely romantic and impractical, it's almost sublime. As the world ended, as the sky fell, as he starved, his final defining gesture was one of human connection. He was not a prince, not a writer, not a soldier, but he could be a husband. Perhaps it was not a grand passion like his first marriage, but something more desperate, more essential, a simple huddling for warmth against the coming storm, a final defiant refusal to die completely alone. His daily life was now a slow, humiliating march toward the end. He was a man out of time, a man of 3 lost eras. His first world, the Habsburg Empire, was a distant memory, a museum piece he had once guided tourists through. His second world, the intellectual ferment of the Weimar Republic, had been murdered. His third world, the cold, brutal reality of Nazi Germany, had no place for him at all. He was, in the end, the ultimate exile. Exiled from his family by choice, exiled from his country by revolution, and now exiled from his own time by a history he could no longer comprehend. He, who had mastered 7 languages, was now living in a country where the only words that mattered were Heil Hitler, words he surely could not bring himself to speak. He was starving, slowly. He was ill. And he was, in the way that truly matters, completely, profoundly alone. On July 4th, 1935, Leopold Wölfling died. His death was as quiet and anonymous as his final years had been. There was no ceremony, no bells tolled in Vienna, no newspapers in Austria or Hungary. The lands his ancestors had ruled for a millennium even noted his passing. A local Berlin doctor simply signed a death certificate for an impoverished, elderly resident of a 3rd-floor tenement flat. The grand, chaotic, defiant life of Imperial and Royal Archduke Leopold Ferdinand of Austria, Prince of Tuscany, had ended not with a bang, not even with a whimper, but with a bureaucratic signature in a cold, sparse room. And the final, crushing, perfect irony? The date? July 4th, the ultimate symbol of independence. The day the world celebrates a new nation's defiant renunciation of an old, repressive empire. On this day, the man who had sacrificed his own empire, his own fortune, his own name, all for the sake of personal independence, died, having achieved none of it. He died a stateless, penniless, forgotten man, a subject of a new tyranny far more absolute than any king. Fate, it seems, has a brutal, poetic sense of humor. The immediate chaos of his death was just as bleak. He left nothing, no heirs. His 3 marriages had been childless. His one illegitimate daughter, Leopoldina, had disappeared into the anonymity of the common world, her lineage severed. With Leopold, his entire branch of the mighty Habsburg Tuscany line was extinguished. It was a complete biological, dynastic, and financial dead end. His widow Clara, his companion in the final dark years, was left with his debts and a few threadbare suits. The sale of his last few pieces of silverware was the final pathetic transaction, the last buyout in a life defined by them. He had been bought out of his family for 200,000 florins, and now his entire worldly existence was sold off for the price of a few meals. He had been erased. The man, Leopold Wölfling, was dead, erased by poverty and an administrative signature. But his story, the myth of the salami salesman prince, was only just beginning. What is left of the man who traded an empire for a kiss? His ironic significance is perhaps more powerful than he could have ever known. His family, the ones he abandoned, continued. His brother Archduke Joseph Ferdinand, though also struggling with the New World, eventually preserved the Tuscan line. It continued modestly, quietly. But Leopold's story, his dramatic public failure, became the dynasty's most potent epitaph. More than any political treaty, his life exposed the rot at the heart of the Habsburg system. His renunciation proved that the dynasty's rigid rules, its obsession with blood purity, its suppression of all personal feeling were no longer sustainable. He was a symptom of the disease, and his flight was the crisis that proved the illness was terminal, years before the war finally killed the patient. And in his failure, he became an accidental prophet. Leopold, the product of Europe's purest bloodline, the man whose eccentricities and impulsiveness were the direct biological result of centuries of inbreeding, was the perfect person to see the lie of Nazism. He had lived in his own mind and body the true cost of blood purity. It was not strength, it was fragility. It was not superiority, it was instability. His 1932 articles, written in obscurity and poverty, were a warning, an eerie prophetic cry from the one man in the world who truly knew he died forgotten, his memoirs and writings buried, just as the very horrors he warned against were about to consume the world. In the end, we circle back to the hook, the prince who became a nobody. Leopold Ferdinand was a cautionary tale, but not just about love or impulsiveness. He was a 19th century romantic, a man who believed in grand gestures and the supreme power of personal will, who collided fatally with the brutal, impersonal political realities of the 20th century. He was undone, not just by his personal flaws, but by his fate. And in a final tragic irony, his flaws, his impulsiveness, his arrogance, his romanticism were his Habsburg inheritance. He was, in every sense, a true son of the dynasty he tried to flee. He was the mold breaker who, in shattering the mold, shattered himself. He does not live on in the grand halls of history, but as a faint, poignant, and deeply human echo in the footnotes, a story of what happens when a single, flawed, passionate heart dares to defy an empire, and in winning his freedom, loses the world.